Hey, welcome back. This is Chem 300. We're continuing chapter 3, this time talking about physical and chemical properties of matter. So matter can be further described by the physical and chemical properties of the matter. So let's start with what a physical property is. So a physical property is a property that a substance displays without changing its composition. So it can display physical properties and keep its identity. Versus a chemical property is a property that a substance displays only by changing its composition, by undergoing some sort of chemical change, where there's bonds that are being broken and chemical bonds that are being made, so that the substance undergoes a change and is no longer the same substance at the end of the change. It changes its composition. So some examples of physical properties, things like the color of a substance, right? You can observe the color without changing the substance. How hard it is, the hardness, the malleability, that means if it's bendable, like if you can take a piece of metal, like soft metal, like sodium, and kind of bend it or flex it. Its solubility, how well it dissolves in water. You can dissolve something in water without changing its identity, so that's a physical property. The density, the ratio of its mass to volume. You can check the density of something without having to change its composition. And the melting and boiling points. For example, water, we can take ice, solid water, and melt it to liquid water. And at the end, it's still water. So it underwent a phase change, but it didn't change its identity. So it's displaying the physical property of its melting point. Same thing with boiling point. You can take liquid water, you can heat it up. It'll turn into gas water, which we call steam. It's still water after that change. So it just displayed the physical property of its boiling point. Some chemical properties. Chemical properties are those that are displayed when a substance undergoes a chemical change. So the flammability of something, if something combusts and burns, let's say you start out with a log of wood and you burn it. At the end of burning that piece of wood, you no longer have the same wood that you had at the beginning. It changed forms. You've got some ash and you created a bunch of smoke and carbon dioxide and some steam, some water vapor. So the composition changed. And through that change, we observed the chemical property that that substance was flammable. Reactivity, there's many types of reactivity. If something like reacts strongly with water or reacts strongly with acid, that's a chemical property. It displays that property by changing its identity when it goes through a chemical reaction. Toxicity and acidity, if something's acidic and corrosive or if something's toxic, those are also chemical properties. So, for example, more examples, the characteristic odor of gasoline is a physical property, right? When gasoline, you smell it like you're at the gas pump. You're smelling the gasoline because the liquid form of the gasoline has vaporized into a gas, and that gas floats through the air, goes into your nose, and you detect it with your just lost my train of thought. You're able to smell it and detect it with the receptors in your nose that detect scent. But gasoline doesn't change its composition when it undergoes this physical, shows you this physical property. It's still gasoline, it just changed phases, but it's still the same thing. So odor is a physical property. If something doesn't have to change its identity in order for you to smell it, that's a physical property. These tend to be things like dealing with our five senses, things you can smell, things you can touch, you can taste, you can see, and you can feel. An example of a chemical property is flammability. The flammability of gasoline is a chemical property of gasoline. Gasoline changes its composition when it burns. You start out with gasoline, you combust it, it turns into carbon dioxide and water. Some more examples. Phase changes, when something changes from a liquid to a gas or from a solid to a liquid. These might seem like they're chemical changes, but they're not. They're actually physical changes. So think about water. Think about melting an ice cube. You put an ice cube out in the summer, starts out as solid water, it melts into liquid water. You still have water at the beginning and the end of that process. So that's a physical property. You're showing the melting point, the physical property of water when it undergoes that process. So let's do an example. This is very similar to one of the ones you're going to see in your homework. So which of the following is a chemical property of gasoline? Boiling point, density, odor, or flammability? So which one requires it undergoes a change? It changes its identity because some bonds have been broken, some new bonds have been made in order for you to detect it. Not boiling point, that's a physical property. So not that one. Boiling point is a phase change related physical property when something goes from a liquid to a gas. Doesn't have to change its identity to do that. Density won't be density. The density of gasoline doesn't change based on how much gasoline you have. It's always the same. Odor, do you have to change the chemical composition, the identity of gasoline in order to smell it? You don't. You can just have, a canister of gasoline and smell it, and you are smelling the gasoline without having to chemically do anything to it. So these are all physical properties. And then we get to flammability. This is burning. Or in chemistry, we call it combustion. So when you burn gasoline, it changes into something else. You no longer have gasoline left if you completely combust it or burn it. And so the physical property, the chemical property you're observing there is the flammability of gasoline. It undergoes a chemical change, and you observe that chemical change as the chemical property of flammability. So the answer to this one is D. Flammability is a chemical property of gasoline. Okay, so we're going to continue. The next one I suggest you watch right after this one because they go hand in hand. We were just talking about physical and chemical properties. Next, we're going to talk about physical and chemical changes, and they're directly related to each other. The change is the process, and the property is what we observe. So we just talked about how you observe things, like you can smell the odor, or you can watch something burn, be flammable. We're going to talk about the actual changes that cause these properties to be observed. So that's what's coming up next. Thanks, everybody. Bye.